All right, welcome to our third and final part of our lecture on DeWitt's chapter 29 on Darwinian evolution. We're going to work through a few details here, some of which aren't covered in DeWitt. Hopefully that'll help tie this together in a package that helps it make more sense to you. So, Darwin very explicitly models natural selection on artificial selection. Just as breeders select for features in dogs or in corn, nature, though not with any conscious purpose, selects among an excess of candidates which ones are going to survive, and the traits that contribute to survival are, over the long run and on average, going to persist, whereas less favorable traits will not. Darwin was not unique in recognizing these ingredients or in combining them. As we've seen, Wallace did essentially the same thing. Darwin's grandfather and some other predecessors came close. What Darwin does is integrate a ton of evidence around these basic principles. Arguably, the two greatest works in the history of science, Newton's Principia and Darwin's Origin of Species, use the same literary style, the same presentation of technique. Tons of data, very slow inferential steps. If you want to start a gigantic revolution, as both Newton and Darwin effectively did, you do so very calmly, very slowly, and with just an abundance of evidence. But there's another parallel with Newton that DeWitt does not bring out very well, and that fits our story. It's a story about the lack of a mechanism. What's the parallel with Darwin? Clearly gravity, right? People like Leibniz said, Ike, buddy, how does the moon pull on the earth and the earth pull on the moon without a rope? Darwin's critics said to him, how are traits passed from parents to offspring? And Darwin had very little to say about that. In Darwin's time, there was a real problem for getting his view accepted, which is many people thought traits are passed from parents to offspring and blended, right? Children often look like a mix of the traits of their parents. Blending is actually incompatible. This is an oversimplification, but it's basically right, with evolution via natural selection. Why is that? Because the novel traits, the ones that are supposed to make a significant difference to reproductive success, get diluted if they are blended with common traits. You won't get the distinctive traits to catch on and generate a reproductive advantage. And so the whole model, mathematically and as it were metaphysically, really doesn't work if, as seemed very plausible in the 19th century, you blend the traits of the two parents in the children. A similar objection comes from the dominant Lamarckian view of evolution. So not all evolution is evolution by natural selection. For Lamarck, if a trait is acquired in the individual's lifetime, the classic model is giraffes stretch their necks by straining for food, and they acquire longer necks in their lives and then pass that trait on to their offspring. There's little work for random variation and natural selection to do, right? All the work is being done in the lifespan of the organism and not in anything like genes. And of course, Darwin didn't know anything about genes. Mendel comes later in terms of integration into the biological canon, and Mendel's genetics was for a long while thought to be fundamentally incompatible with Darwinism. One of the central achievements of the modern synthesis in the 1920s is to integrate genetics with Darwinism. So I gave you a whole bunch of misguided objections to Darwinian evolution by natural selection in the previous two lectures here. But there were very solid ones as well. The absence of a mechanism is itself a problem. The mechanism that turns out to be approximately right, genetics, was for good empirical reasons thought to be incompatible with Darwinism, as the blending conception was incompatible with Darwinism and the Lamarckian view. So there were genuine, serious scientific problems for the Darwinian view, many of which were solved by the modern synthesis in the 1920s. Why is genetics reasonably thought, until at least the 1920s, to be incompatible with Darwinism? roughly it's the kind of picture we saw when we were discussing the calculus. Continuous math, things like calculus, tend to fit what Darwin had to say about evolution. Very slow change with no fundamental discrete units. Whereas Mendel was talking about something in the biological realm, kind of like quanta in quantum physics, right? This is not continuous math, this is discrete math. There are units of selection. And that tended to make for what was called a saltationist view. There are periods of stasis and then big leaps as a trait catches on. So Darwin and his ilk tended to emphasize continuous mathematics and gradualism, whereas the followers of Mendel had discrete mathematics in mind and a much jumpier process. It wasn't until the 1920s, with some statistical tools and some conceptual work and some empirical work, that you get what is now recognizable as modern biology. So from the 1860s, late 1850s, when Darwin published, for 70 years or so, roughly the amount of time it took Copernicus's work to really become standard, same kind of thing happened with Darwin. Prior to that, some biologists were mathematical modelers, some were experimentalists, and they had frameworks that could not reasonably be taken to be integrated. Once you get the modern synthesis, evolution gets defined no longer in terms of traits in organisms, but in frequencies of variance of a gene over time. So genes are now definitionally central to the notion of evolution by natural selection. But if you've read some popular quasi-philosophical stuff about genetics, like Dawkins' The Selfish Gene, don't get confused here. Genes are undeniably central in evolution, but they are not necessarily the sole units of selection. DeWitt talks about things like bottlenecks. If due to, say, a natural disaster, only a small and less diverse population of a certain kind of organism survives, selection might be operating on the group. That group might have the property of being genetically homogeneous. That's not a property a gene can have. It's not a property an organism can have. It's a property that only a group of organisms can have. And so arguably, evolution operates on individual genes, on organisms, and on groups of organisms. I'm not taking a stand on that, but I'm just saying the centrality of defining evolution in terms of genes rather than traits of organisms or of groups is to be distinguished from the much stronger claim that people like Dawkins make, that evolution operates only at the level of genetics. Natural selection is not the entirety of the modern synthesis. It is a causal explanation, but not the only causal explanation for changes in distributions of genes from one generation to another. Natural selection is that part of the explanation that explains the genes as due to differential reproduction, due to differential fitness, right? Some creatures are better able to survive in a given relatively constant environment. All other things equal, they will tend to reproduce, and so their genes will tend to get increased representation compared to other causal explanations of genes in the next generation. I find DeWitt a little misleading about this, because gene flow and mutation, which he contrasts with natural selection, are really explanations of a different phenomenon. How you get a gene variant into a population, whereas natural selection is about how it persists or fails to persist. The more appropriate contrast with natural selection is genetic drift. That is a matter of chance factors that play a causal explanation in the distribution of genes from one generation to another. So if we take two organisms that are approximately equally adapted to their environment, and one of them faces bad luck, a natural disaster, for instance, that is not natural selection. That's genetic drift. DeWitt walks you through an example of how powerful genetic drift can be, especially when you're dealing with small populations. A little bit of luck can make a huge difference to whether genes continue in succeeding generations or not. Not every causal explanation of why a gene persists in a population or disappears from a population is an explanation in terms of natural selection. Genetic drift is roughly luck. This makes evolution less testable than one might have hoped, and that was part of Popper's diatribe in the late 60s and early 70s against evolution. As you might remember from way back in August, he recanted. Probabilistic theories are hard to test in the single case because it's not clear what the truth maker is for saying that something is likely to be the case. It either happens or it doesn't. But over many trials, as with quantum mechanics, you can make mathematically precise predictions that Popper came to agree show you that evolution by natural selection is testable and in fact has been rigorously tested and so far done very well. There's a bunch of stuff here if you're a bio major I invite you to email me about or raise discussions with me about how this stuff works. So if you know anything about statistics, the null hypothesis against which you evaluate evolution by natural selection is not constancy. It's not the gene staying the same. It's a hypothesis based in genetic drift, how much chance variation you would expect. And then you explain that variation that is not due to chance as potentially due to natural selection. Finally, I'm about to shut up before we turn to our final chapter in DeWitt, but one more confusion that I think we're now in a better position to appreciate. In the popular press, you see an ungodly amount of confusion of correlation with causation in discussions of genes and traits. People write as if whenever there is a robust correlation between a gene and a trait, the gene is for that trait. A bunch of fancy stuff here we're not going to have time to go into. Genes code for proteins. Proteins don't directly produce traits, but only under very complicated conditions in which the environment gets a say. I'm not making as fancy a point as this. Here's what I'm trying to warn against. A certain gene might be much more common among Russians than among Pakistanis, and so if I know this person has this gene, I might have excellent statistical evidence that she's a Russian speaker rather than an Urdu speaker, but you wouldn't begin to think that the gene causes one to speak Russian. But people do this kind of stuff all the time. The details matter as you're studying for the final, but as a human being going forward, just try to identify the basics of these confusions that cause evolution to be a much more controversial theory than it is. DeWitt is going to argue in his next chapter that it has some pretty shocking implications. We'll see to what extent we find ourselves in agreement with him. Thanks as always for your time and attention.